Likelihood. The likelihood of occurrence is a weighted risk factor based on an analysis of the probability that a given threat is capable of exploiting a given vulnerability or set of vulnerabilities. The likelihood risk factor combines an estimate of the likelihood that the threat event will be initiated with an estimate of the likelihood of impact. For example, the likelihood that the threat event results in adverse impact. For adversaries threats, an assessment of likelihood of occurrence is typically based on first, adversary intent, second, adversary capability, and third, adversary targeting. For other than adversaries threat events, the likelihood of occurrence is estimated using historical evidence, empirical data, or other factors. Note that the likelihood that a threat event will be initiated or will occur is assessed with respect to a specific time frame, for example, the next 6 months, the next year, or the period until a specified milestone is reached. If a threat event is almost certain to be initiated or occur in the specified or implicit time frame, the risk assessment may take into consideration the estimated frequency of the event. The likelihood of threat occurrence can also be based on the state of the organization, including, for example, its core mission or business processes, enterprise architecture, information security architecture, information systems, and environments in which those systems operate. Taking into consideration predisposing conditions and the presence and effectiveness of deployed security controls to protect against unauthorized or undesirable behavior, detect and limit damage, and or maintain or restore mission or business capabilities. The likelihood of impact addresses the probability or possibility that the threat event will result in adverse impact, regardless of the magnitude of harm that can be expected. Organizations typically employ a three-step process to determine the overall likelihood of threat events. First, organizations assess the likelihood that threat events will be initiated for adversarial threat events or will occur for non-adversarial threat events. Second, organizations assess the likelihood that the threat events, once initiated or occurring, will result in adverse impacts or harm to organizational operations and assets, individuals, other organizations, or the nation. Finally, organizations assess the overall likelihood as a combination of likelihood of initiation or occurrence and likelihood of resulting in adverse impact. Threat vulnerability pairing. For example, establishing a one-to-one relationship between threats and vulnerabilities may be undesirable when assessing likelihood at the mission or business function level, and in many cases can be problematic even at the information system level due to a potentially large number of threats and vulnerabilities. This approach typically drives the level of detail in undefined threat events and vulnerabilities, rather than allowing organizations to make effective use of threat information and or to identify threats at a level of detail that is meaningful. Depending on the level of detail in threat specification, a given threat event could exploit multiple vulnerabilities. In assessing likelihoods, organizations examine vulnerabilities that threat events could exploit and also the mission or business function susceptibility to events for which no security controls or viable implementations of security controls exist. For example, due to functional dependencies, particularly external dependencies. In certain situations, the most effective way to reduce mission or business risk attributable to information security risk is to redesign the mission or business processes so there are viable workaround when information systems are compromised. Using the concept of threat scenarios described above may help organizations overcome some of the limitations of threat vulnerability pairing. Impact. The level of impact from a threat event is the magnitude of harm that can be expected to result from the consequences of unauthorized disclosure of information, unauthorized modification of information, unauthorized destruction of information, or loss of information, or information system availability. Such harm can be experienced by a variety of organizational and non-organizational stakeholders, including, for example, heads of agencies, mission or business owners, information owners or stewards, mission or business process owners, information system owners, or individuals or groups in the public or private sectors relying on the organization. In essence, anyone with the vested interest in an organization's operations, assets, or individuals, including other organizations in partnership with the organizations or the nation. Organizations make explicit, first, the process used to conduct impact determinations; second, assumption related to impact determinations; third, sources and methods for obtaining impact information; and fourth, the rationale for conclusions reached with regard to impact determinations. Organizations may explicitly define how established priorities and values guide the identification of high-value assets and the potential adverse impacts to organizational stakeholders. If such information is not defined, priorities and values related to identifying targets of threat sources and associated organizational impacts can typically be derived from strategic planning and policies. For example, security categorization levels indicate the organizational impacts of compromising different types of information. Privacy impact assessments and criticality levels, when defined as part of contingency planning or mission or business impact analysis, indicate the adverse impacts of destruction, corruption, or loss of accountability for information resources to organizations. Strategic plans and policies also assert or imply the relative priorities of immediate or near-term mission or business, function, accomplishment, and long-term organizational viability, which can be undermined by the loss of reputation or by sanctions resulting from the compromise of sensitive information. Organizations can also consider the range of effects of threat events, including the relative size of the set of resources affected, when making final impact determinations. Risk tolerance assumptions may state that threat events with an impact below a specific value do not warrant further analysis. Risk. Figure 3 illustrates an example of a risk model including the key risk factors discussed above and the relationship among the factors. Each of the risk factors is used in the risk assessment process in Chapter 3. As noted above, risk is a function of the likelihood of a threat event's occurrence and potential adverse impact should the event occur. This definition accommodates many types of adverse impacts at all tiers in the risk management hierarchy described in Special Publication 800-39. Damage to image or reputation of the organization or financial loss at Tier 1, inability to successfully execute a specific mission or business process at Tier 2, or the resources expended in responding to an information system incident at Tier 3. It also accommodates relationship among impacts, for example, loss of current or future mission or business effectiveness due to the loss of the data confidentiality, loss of confidence in critical information due to loss of data or system integrity, or unavailability of degradation of information or information systems. This broad definition also allows risk to be represented as a single value or as a vector. For example, multiple values in which different types of impacts are assessed separately. For purposes of risk communication, risk is generally grouped according to the types of adverse impacts and possibly the time frame in which those impacts are likely to be experienced. Aggregation. Organizations may use risk aggregation to roll up several discrete or lower level risk into a more general or higher level risk. Organizations may also use risk aggregation to efficiently manage the scope and scale of risk assessments involving multiple information systems and multiple mission or business processes with specified relationships and dependencies among those systems and processes. Risk aggregation, conducted primarily at tiers 1 and 2 and occasionally at tier 3, assessed and the overall risk to organizational operations, assets, and individuals given the set of discrete risks. In general, for discrete risks, for example, the risk associated with a single information system supporting a well-defined mission or business process, the worst-case impact establishes an upper bound for the overall risk to organizational operations, assets, and individuals. One issue for risk aggregation is that this upper bound for risk may fail to apply. For example, it may be advantageous for organizations to assess risk at the organization's level when multiple risks materialize concurrently or when the same risk materializes repeatedly over a period of time. In such situations, there is the possibility that the amount of overall risk incurred is beyond the risk capacity of the organizations, and therefore the overall impact to organizational operations and assets, for example missions or business impact, goes beyond that which was originally assessed for each specific risk. When aggregating risk, organizations consider the relationship among various discrete risks. For example, there may be a cause and effect relationship, and that if one risk materializes, another risk is more or less likely to materialize. If there is a direct or inverse relationship among discrete risks, then the risk can be coupled in a qualitative sense or correlated in a quantitative sense, either in a positive or negative manner. Risk coupling or correlation, for example, finding relationships among risks that increase or decrease the likelihood of any specific risk materializing, can be done at tiers 1, 2, 3. Uncertainty. Uncertainty is inherent in the evaluation of risk due to such considerations as, first, limitations on the extent to which the future will resemble the past. Second, imperfect or incomplete knowledge of the threat. For example, characteristics of adversaries including tactics, techniques, and procedures. Third, undiscovered vulnerabilities in technologies or products. And fourth, unrecognized dependencies which can lead to unforeseen impacts. Uncertainty about the value of specific risk factors can also be due to the step in the RMF or phase in the system development life cycle at which a risk assessment is performed. For example, at early phases in the system development life cycle, the presence and effectiveness of security controls may be unknown, while at later phases in the life cycle, the cost of evaluating control effectiveness may outweigh the benefits in terms of more fully informed decision making. Finally, uncertainty can be due to incomplete knowledge of the risk associated with data information systems, mission, business processes, services, common infrastructures, and or organizations. The degree of uncertainty in risk assessment results due to these different reasons can be communicated in the form of the results. For example, by expressing results qualitatively, by providing ranges of values rather than single values for identified risks, or by using a visual representations of fuzzy regions rather than points. Assessment approaches. Risk and its contributing factors can be assessed in a variety of ways, including quantitatively, qualitatively, or semi-quantitatively. Each risk assessment approach considered by organizations has advantages and disadvantages. A preferred approach or a situation-specific set of approaches can be selected based on organizational culture and, in particular, attitudes towards the concept of uncertainty and risk communication. Quantitative assessments typically employ a set of methods, principles, or rules for assessing risk based on the use of numbers, where the meanings and proportionality of values are maintained inside and outside of the context of their assessment. This type of assessment most effectively supports cost-benefit analysis of alternative risk responses or courses of action. However, the meaning of the quantitative results may not always be clear and may require interpretation and explanation, particularly to explain the assumptions and constraints on using the results. For example, organizations may typically ask if the numbers or results obtained in the risk assessments are reliable or if the differences in obtained values are meaningful or insignificant. Additionally, the rigor of quantification is significantly lessened when subjective determinations are buried within the quantitative assessments or when significant uncertainty surrounds the determination of values. The benefits of quantitative assessments in terms of the rigor, repeatability, and reproducibility of assessment results can in some cases be outweighed by the cost in terms of the expert time and effort and the possible deployment and use of tools required to make such assessments. In contrast, the quantitative assessments, qualitative assessments typically employ a set of methods, principles, or rules of assessing risk based on non-numerical categories or levels. For example, very low, low, moderate, high, very high. This type of assessment supports communicating risk results to decision makers. However, the range of values in qualitative assessments is comparatively small in most cases, making the relative prioritization or comparison within the set of reported risks difficult. Additionally, unless each value is very clearly defined or is characterized by meaningful examples, different experts relying on their individual experiences could produce significantly different assessment results. The repeatability and reproducibility of qualitative assessments are increased by the annotation of assessed values. For example, this value is high because of the following reasons, and by the use of tables or other well-defined functions to combine qualitative values. Finally, semi-quantitative assessments typically employ a set of methods, principles, or rules for assessing risk that uses bins, scales, or representative numbers whose values and meanings are not maintained in other contexts. This type of assessment can provide the benefits of quantitative and qualitative assessments. The bins, for example, 0 to 15, 16 to 35, 36 to 70, 71 to 85, 86 to 100, or scales, for example, 1 to 10, translate easily into qualitative terms that support risk communications for decision makers. For example, a score of 95 can be interpreted as very high, while also allowing relative comparisons between values in different bins or even without the same bin. For example, the difference between risks scored 70 and 71 respectively is relatively insignificant, while the difference between risks scored 36 and 70 is relatively significant. The role of expert judgment is in assigning values is more evident than in a purely quantitative approach. Moreover, if the scales or sets of bins provide sufficient granularity, relative prioritization among results is better supported than in a purely qualitative approach. As in a quantitative approach, rigor is significantly lessened when subjective determinations are buried within assessments or when significant uncertainty surrounds the determination of values. As with the non-numeric categories or levels used in a well-founded qualitative approach, each bin or range of values needs to be clearly defined and or categorized by meaningful examples. Independent of the type of value scale selected, assessments make explicit or the temporal element of risk factors. For example, organizations can associate a specific time period with assessments of likelihood of occurrence and assessments of impact severity. Analysis approaches. Analysis approaches differ with respect to the orientation or starting point of the risk assessment, level of detail in the assessment, and how risks due to similar threat scenarios are treated. An analysis approach can be first, threat-oriented, second, asset or impact-oriented, or third, vulnerability-oriented. A threat-oriented approach starts with the identification of threat sources and threat events and focuses on the development of threat scenarios. Vulnerabilities are identified in the context of threats, and for adversarial threats, impacts are identified based on adversary intent. An asset or impact-oriented approach starts with the identification of impacts or consequences of concern and critical assets, possibly using the results of a mission or business impact analysis and identifying threat events that could lead to and or threat sources that could seek those impacts or consequences. A vulnerability-oriented approach starts with a set of predisposing conditions or exploitable weaknesses or deficiencies in organizational information systems or the environments in which the systems operate, and identifies threat events that could exercise those vulnerabilities together with possible consequences of vulnerabilities being exercised. Each analysis approach takes into consideration the same risk factors, and thus entails the same set of risk assessment activities, albeit in different order. Differences in the start point of the risk assessment can potentially bias the results, causing some risks not to be identified. Therefore, identification of risks from a second orientation, for example, complementing a threat-oriented analysis approach with an asset or impact-oriented analysis approach, can improve the rigor and effectiveness of the analysis. In addition to the orientation of the analysis approach, organizations can apply more rigorous analysis techniques, for example, graph-based analysis, to provide an effective way to account for the many-to-many relationships between, first, threat sources and threat events. A single threat event can be caused by multiple threat sources, and a single threat source can cause multiple threat events. Second, threat events and vulnerabilities. For example, a single threat event can exploit multiple vulnerabilities, and a single vulnerability can be exploited by multiple threat events. And third, threat events and impacts or assets. For example, a single threat event can affect multiple assets or have multiple impacts, and a single asset can be affected by multiple threat events. Rigorous analysis approaches also provide a way to account for whether in the time frame for which risks are assessed, a specific adverse impact could occur, or a specific asset could be harmed at most once, or perhaps repeatedly, depending on the nature of the impacts and on how organizations, including mission or business processes or information systems, recover from such adverse impacts. Effects of organizational culture and risk assessments. Organizations can differ in their risk models, assessment approaches, and analysis approaches that they prefer for a variety of reasons. For example, cultural issues can predispose organizations to employ risk models that assume a constant value for one or more possible risk factors, so that some factors that are present in other organizations' models are not represented. Culture can also predispose organizations to employ risk models that require detailed analysis using quantitative assessments, for example, nuclear safety. Alternatively, organizations may prefer qualitative or semi-quantitative assessment approaches. In addition to differences among organizations, differences can also exist within organizations. For example, organizations can use coarse or high-level risk models early in a system development lifecycle to select security controls, and subsequently more detailed models to assess risk to given missions or business functions. Organizational risk frames determine which risk models, assessment approaches, and analysis approaches to use under variety of circumstances. The use of risk models. A single risk model consisting of a fixed set of factors, a fixed assessment scale for each factor, and a fixed algorithm for combining factors cannot meet the diverse needs of their organizations in the public and private sectors that rely on special publication 800-30. For example, while some organizations may emphasize adversaries, threats, and provide detailed information about such threats, other organizations may choose instead to focus on non-adversarial threats, providing greater detail for those types of threats and lesser detail for adversaries' threats. Therefore, the risk models developed by organizations with different assumptions regarding threats will involve different factors as well as different levels of detail. Similarly, within a single organization or community of interest, different assessment scales may be appropriate for different missions or business functions, different categories of information systems, and or for systems at different stages in the system development lifecycle. For example, during an initial risk assessment performed when an information system is first being considered, the information available about threats and vulnerabilities may be non-specific and highly uncertain. For such risk assessments, a qualitative assessment using only a few factors may be appropriate. By contrast, a risk assessment informed by security controls assessment can be far more specific, and estimates can be made with greater fidelity. For such assessments, a semi-quantitative assessment using the 0 to 100 value scales may be more appropriate. The expectations set forth in special publications 800-39 and 800-30 is that each organization or community will define a risk model appropriate to its view of risk. For example, formulas that reflect organizational or community views of which risk factors must be considered, which factors can be combined, which factors must be further decomposed, and how assessed values should be combined algorithmically. Special publication 800-30 does identify risk factors that are common across a wide spectrum of risk models, in addition by defining multiple aligned value scales. This publication provides a foundation for a consistent approach to estimate information security risk across the system development lifecycle, without forcing assessments early in the life cycle to be more detailed than can be justified by the available information. Application of risk assessments. As stated previously, risk assessments can be conducted at all three tiers in the risk management hierarchy: organization level, mission and business process level, and information system level. Figure 4 illustrates the risk management hierarchy defined in NIST Special Publication 800-39, which provides multiple risk perspectives from the strategic level to the tactical level. Traditional risk assessments generally focus at the Tier 3 level, for example information system level, and as a result tend to overlook other significant risk factors that may be more appropriately assessed at the Tier 1 or 2 levels. For example, exposure of a core mission or business function to an adversarial threat based on information system interconnections. Risk assessments support risk response decisions at the different tiers of the risk management hierarchy. At Tier 1, risk assessments can affect, for example, first, organization-wide information security programs, policies, procedures, and guidance. Second, the types of appropriate risk responses, for example, risk acceptance, avoidance, mitigation, sharing, and transfer. Third, investment decision for information technologies or systems. Fourth, procurements. Fifth, minimum organization-wide security controls. Sixth, conformance to enterprise security architectures. And 7, monitoring strategies and ongoing authorizations of information systems and common controls. At Tier 2, risk assessments can affect, for example, first, enterprise architecture or security, architecture design decisions. Second, the selection of common controls. Third, the selection of suppliers, services, and contractors to support organizational missions or business functions. 4. The development of risk-aware mission or business processes. And 5. The interpretation of information security policies with respect to organizational information systems and environments in which those systems operate. Finally, at Tier 3, risk assessments can affect, for example, first, design decisions, including the selection, tailoring, and supplementation of security controls, and the selection of information technology products for organizational information systems. Second, implementation decisions, including whether specific information technology products or product configurations meet security control requirements. And third, operational decisions, including the requisite level of monitoring activity, the frequency of ongoing information system authorizations, and system maintenance decisions. Risk assessments can also inform other risk management activities across the 3 tiers that are non-security related. For example, at Tier 1, risk assessments can provide useful inputs to, first, operational risk determinations, including business continuity for organizational missions and business functions. Second, organizational risk determinations, including financial risk, compliance risk, regulatory risk, reputation risk, and cumulative acquisition risk across large-scale projects. And third, multiple impact risk, including supply chain risk and risk involving partnerships. At Tier 2, risk assessments can provide the same useful inputs to operational organizations and multiple impact risks, specific to mission or business processes. At Tier 3, risk assessments can inform assessments of cost, schedule, and performance risk associated with information systems, with information security experts coordinating with program managers. information system owners, and authorizing officials. This type of coordination is essential within organizations in order to eliminate silos and/or stovepiped activities that produce less than optimal or inefficient information technology and security solutions, thus affecting the ability of organizations to carry out assigned missions or business functions with maximum efficiency and cost effectiveness. It is important to know that information security risk contributes to non-security risks at each tier. Thus, the results of a risk assessments at a given tier serve as inputs to and are aligned with non-security risk management activities at that tier. In addition, the results of risk assessments at lower tiers serve as inputs to risk assessments at higher tiers. Risks can arise on different time scales. For example, the disclosure of information about current organizational operations can compromise the effectiveness of those operations immediately, while the disclosure of strategic plan information can compromise future operational capabilities. Risk response decisions can also take effect in different time frames. For example, changes in organizational policies or investment strategies can sometimes require years to take effect, while configuration changes in an individual system can often be implemented immediately. In general, the risk management process tends to move more slowly at tiers 1 and 2 than tier 3. This is due to how organizations typically respond to risks that potentially affect widespread organizational operations and assets where such risk responses may need to address systemic or institutional issues. However, some Tier 1 decisions, for example newly discovered threats or vulnerabilities requiring the implementation of an organization-wide mandate for mitigation, can involve immediate action.